I'm not gonna lie, when I first saw Valheim, I thought it was just another generic open world survival crafting unnecessary Rust clone that we've seen all too many of over the years. But to modernize an old adage, you should never judge a game by its Steam page, because this is actually a good ass game. Valheim is the first open world survival game that I've properly enjoyed in quite a while. It's a bit of a breath of fresh air in a genre that's been done to death ever since Minecraft's survival mode exploded onto the scene all those years ago, but the game doesn't just follow a copy-paste formula. It has far more of an emphasis on its combat and exploration than many other games in its genre, and features 5 bosses for you and up to 9 other friends to hunt, all allowing you to progress further into its procedurally generated world upon defeat. The game does have a tendency to get rather grindy at times, and is certainly the sort of game you'll need to be willing to invest some time into, but it has a nice sense of progression and allows you to get creative as well, and despite me not being a huge fan of its visuals, it's augmented brilliantly by its music and sound design. The game has rocketed its way to over 4 million copies sold since its launch at the start of February, and despite being in early access, I found myself clocking in over 50 hours. And I've still got a ways to go before I'm through with it. Valheim takes place in some sort of weird Viking purgatory, where you, the reincarnation of some crazy ass Viking, have been tasked with eradicating giant boss monsters, because Odin's busy and he just doesn't feel like it. It plonks you into its world via giant crow, lets you read some weird runestones, and then sets you off on your way with a slightly smaller crow that flies in to have a chat every now and again as your only guide, as you gather resources, build a shelter, and explore the game's procedurally generated world. The thing about Valheim is that it's not really a survival game. I mean, it's a survival game in the sense that dying is not encouraged, but it does away with the tedium of a lot of other survival games and focuses more on the parts of the game that are actually fun. You don't need to drink water or sleep. Hell, you don't have to eat food because you won't starve to death, but it's probably still a good idea. I just find that the game is more focused on being an open world action and exploration game, something more akin to Terraria in many ways, more so than a game like Rust. Valheim also shares a similar sense of progression to Terraria, largely in how defeating its various bosses and exploring dungeons will allow you to delve further into the game and unlock new tools and tiers of gear, as well as a sort of Elder Scrolls / Runescape level up system where your skills will increase as you perform specific actions. So naturally I began jumping as I walked everywhere like I was playing Oblivion. Exploring your surroundings and embarking on a journey via the sea to discover new islands and biomes is a big part of the game, which pairs well with the game's building system and the ability to construct multiple outposts and settlements around the map, allowing you to find optimal locations for gathering certain resources. Each biome will have specific creatures and resources associated with them, such as copper and tin only being available in the Black Forest and iron being available in the swamp, as well as having unique dungeons for you to pilfer through as well. I personally found the game's progression to be very satisfying, going from basic tools to bronze to iron and so forth. It found a nice balance of not giving you anything too powerful right off the bat and making you put the work in to get them, though the game can be rather grindy while gathering materials at times. A lot of this is down to not only the fact that you'll just be hitting rocks for extended periods of time, but also travel time between the biome that you're collecting from and wherever you've set up your base. The way that the game counters this is with its portal system, buildable structures that allow you to set up fast travel points across the map. However, certain items prohibit you from fast traveling, most notably ores and metal bars, meaning that you can't just plonk down a portal next to an ore deposit and use the zip back home in an instant. I suppose this is to encourage you to build multiple outposts rather than just the one, and incentivizes the use of boats and such to traverse the map. I was a little ambivalent about this, as on one hand portals were incredibly overpowered and you can just use them to instantly jump across the map, save for the eye-melting animation that plays when you enter one, but on the other hand they were totally useless and unusable for gathering or transporting certain resources. Perhaps a balance could have been to have them in select locations on the map rather than allowing you to place them wherever, or simply to make the map more concentrated and less spread out. A lot of the biomes are just repeated over and over, so I'm not sure why each map has to be quite as enormous as they are. And while the game does encourage you to build multiple bases, I still preferred to have a main base along with smaller outposts, as rebuilding crafting stations such as forges needed metal, and needing to keep setting up the same crafting stations over and over quickly became tedious. I found Valheim's combat to be reasonably engaging. It wasn't the most intense or interesting combat system I've encountered in a game, but it did the job well enough for a game very centered around it. The game certainly has some difficult moments, especially when you're faced with a large group of enemies. However, some of the larger foes could be cheesed using the environment a little too easily, in particular the Elder Boss, who quickly became incredibly simple. I did, however, find myself with very low stamina much of the time that I was fighting enemies, considering that just about every action you do will drain it, be it swing a weapon, block an attack, sprint, jump, or even sneaking will drain it. I personally was drawn away from sneaking for the most part simply because you would lose stamina while moving in sneaker mode, as if simply moving very slow wasn't enough of a trade-off. I would have also liked to be able to sneak with the bow drawn, as you will stand up and alert enemies whenever you attempt to shoot one while in stealth. Certain other mechanics such as parrying help to keep the combat engaging and more than a mere button mash or just having you hold up a shield, allowing you to stagger enemies or the well-timed block to inflict critical damage on them. I'd still like to see a few extra features added to the combat, such as dual wielding and perhaps some kind of spell casting or summoning system, but overall I was not at all disappointed with what the combat had to offer. Dying in Valheim means dropping all of your gear as well as losing some of your levels, the latter of which feels less punishing, as honestly, the actual benefit from having higher skill levels felt negligible in comparison to simply having better gear, and losing your gear wasn't a huge deal in the early game. However, later on, dying was a major inconvenience, especially when dying a long way from home or in a tricky spot. Me and a friend found out about sea serpents coming out at night the hard way, which led to us needing to regather ourselves for several hours before we could recover our gear. But the worst experience I had with dying was when I got a little too curious after first discovering the plains biome and was introduced to a horde of fuelings, as well as the absolute hellspawn known as death skeetos. And yeah, fair enough, I got cocky and they kicked my ass, but did they also have to camp my corpse and go out of their way to destroy my longship as well? I exhausted what remained of my resources rebuilding boats to sail for 10 minutes to get back to where I died, only to be torn to shreds as the death skeetos that were hanging over my corpse continued to take half of my health per incredibly quick flyby hit. After a few attempts, I had to go full Wii Sports loading screen and take a goddamn break. Eventually, I regathered myself, took a slightly more strategic approach with the portal and managed to regather my items, but that entailed several extra hours of grinding, needing to go back to earlier parts of the game that I'd already spent several hours on. Look, I'm not against the game punishing you for dying, it's there to incentivize not being killed, but when you suddenly lose all your gear, often in scenarios you simply have the misfortune of stumbling upon for the first time and are forced into revisiting earlier parts of the game to get it back, the game quickly becomes a slog and not a lot of fun to play. I think that one way this could be remedied is, again, simply making the map smaller. A big part of what makes regathering your items so tedious is simply the distance you need to travel to get it back, whether that be a long trek on land or needing to rebuild a boat to traverse the sea. Valheim's building system functions not only as a nice creative outlet, but as an important part of the game, requiring you to build roofed structures to use workshops and the like, as well as allowing you to set up bases and outposts around the vast map. It wasn't the greatest building system I've encountered. The ground flattening tools can be a little temperamental, it can be difficult to get paths to snap how you want them to, and building around water is a massive pain in the ass, but it's certainly far from the worst in this genre. The UI is functional enough and isn't horrendously ugly, though I would have liked the inclusion of a quick stack all option for chests as well as a bin option to delete items. Another nitpick would be a lack of a single player pause, which kinda sucks, but one UI feature I did very much enjoy was the ability to mark your map that paired very well with the exploration side of the game. A simple inclusion, but a very useful one. Overall, I was impressed by the game's polish. I can't think of any bugs I encountered at all throughout my playthrough, and the only placeholder I can remember is for slimes in the swamp biome, which in modern early access game development is a rather refreshing sight. The game's visuals are a little... I don't know. I don't see why the game has to have a pixelated art style like it does. If you look at Minecraft, the low-res pixel art works because it's a world made entirely of blocks. Valheim isn't, and while a lot of the time I didn't pay much attention to it, I think a cel-shaded look, something Breath of the Wild-esque, would suit the game so much better, especially when paired with its particle and lighting systems. I did like the music, however. I think the soundtrack is brilliantly atmospheric, and the heavier, intense boss tracks were awesome as well. The background music was a great asset to the overall Valheim experience. Overall, I've rather enjoyed my time spent with Valheim so far, certainly a lot more than I thought I was going to when I first saw it pop up on my Steam recommended page. I'm glad I gave in to peer pressure after seeing a lot of my friends playing it, because like I said, it's a good ass game. I know that early access is a hard sell for many people, but Valheim is a great example of early access being done right. After 50 hours, I still have plenty more content to get through, and for a modest $30 on Steam, this is a great value for money purchase. If you can get a few friends to play it with, I definitely recommend doing that as well. And while there's already plenty of content and a great sense of freedom about it, I'm excited to see what the future holds for this game, and I'd definitely be down to revisit the game with another review in the future. But for those of you impatient bastards out there living in the now, there's already a lot of fun to be had with Valheim.